My wedding dress was hanging on the door when my mother told me my future husband would need to see me again before the ceremony. Not the way a husband sees a bride. The way you check something before you sign for it. The room I remember most clearly from that whole week is not the room where I became a wife. It is the room where I learned I would be examined before I was ever asked. I did not have a word for what was about to happen. No one used a word for it. That was the part of it that made it possible. I felt like something being evaluated, rather than someone being known. My name is Leah Byler. I grew up Old Order Amish in Holmes County, Ohio. Before I ever told you about my wedding night, about the silence, about not knowing what was happening to my own body, there is something that happened before that. Before I was ever touched as a wife, I had already been looked at as one. If this is your first time here, I'm Leah. I tell the stories I was never supposed to say out loud. In the district where I was raised, a wedding was not only a promise between two people. It was a transfer. A household passing its responsibility for a daughter into the hands of another household. Nobody used that word. That was what made it work. If a family was going to send its daughter into another household, her labor, her health, her ability to carry the life everyone expected from her. There was a quiet expectation that everything about her should be known before the vows were spoken. I did not have that language at 19. I only knew that something was about to happen to me that no one was calling by its name. My mother told me the way she told me the dress needed to be pressed before Sunday. Ordinary. Practical. A thing on a list. I asked her, "Will he be there?" She said yes. I asked, "Will I be alone with him?" She said no, Miriam would be present. I asked the only question that actually mattered to me. What will he be looking for? My mother folded the dress she was holding one more time than it needed. She said, "He will look to see that you are well." It sounded like care. Underneath it was something that had never once asked how I felt about being looked at. I want to tell you something about my mother in that moment. She was not cruel when she told me. That was the part that confused me. She sounded sad and obedient, as if she, too, had once stood in a room being told the same thing by someone who had sounded sad and obedient before her. I wanted to ask her if my father had looked at her that way. I wanted to ask if anyone had stood in a room and decided she would do well, but I did not ask. Because daughters in my world learned very early which questions made mothers go quiet. My father and brothers were sent outside. My mother stood near the door. Miriam, an older woman from our church, the kind whose presence meant something was being done correctly, sat near the window with her hands folded. Then Daniel came in, the man everyone had already begun calling my future husband. He did not look at me the way a man looks at the woman he is about to marry. He looked at me the way men looked over a field before deciding whether it would yield. I was asked to stand straight, to turn, to hold out my hands. There were questions about my health, my mother's confinements, how I had recovered from illness as a child, whether I tired easily, whether there was any weakness anyone should know about before the vows were spoken. I answered each one. My voice did not shake. I had practiced not shaking the way I had practiced everything else that was expected of me. Miriam did not look away from any of it. She was not embarrassed. That was what frightened me later. Not her cruelty. Her calm. She had likely sat in that chair before. For other girls, in other rooms. She was not trying to harm me. She believed completely that she was protecting something. The marriage, family, the order of things. In her world, this was not cruelty. It was care wearing a very old coat. After Daniel left, the adults talked in the kitchen, in voices too low for me to follow. I went upstairs alone. I looked down at my own hands, the ones I had just been asked to hold out like something offered for approval. I made my bed, even though it did not need making, because my hands needed proof that they still belonged to me. 2 days later, my mother told me Daniel had a few additional questions. I understood, without being told, what that meant. If the first time had been enough, there would not be a second. The second was shorter, more specific. I do not need to describe it for you to understand what I felt standing there, less like a bride than I had felt the first time. When it was over, I was sent to the kitchen while the adults spoke once more in the front room. I heard Miriam's voice through the door. Just 3 words. She will do well. She will do well. Not she is ready. Not she is willing. Not she is afraid. She will do well. I stood in that kitchen and understood, for the first time clearly, what I actually was in that room. Not a bride. A field that had been walked. An animal that had been assessed. A household tool confirmed to be in working order. The wedding happened 3 days later. 300 guests. Benches carried in from a wagon. Pies and roast chicken and celery standing up in jars like little white trees on the tables. Hymns without instruments sung the way they had always been sung. I wore the blue dress. Everyone called me the bride. Everyone saw a bride. I knew I had been approved. The inspection did not end in that room. It followed me into the marriage, because it had already taught everyone whose opinion mattered on the night that came after it, and the years that came after that. I had not become a wife yet, but I had already learned that my feelings would not part of the marriage. That night, when the house finally went quiet and everyone called me a wife, I remembered Miriam's voice. She will do well. And I understood that the room before the wedding had not been separate from the room after it. One had prepared the other. Years later, in a therapist's office, I told her about that week. She asked me a question no one had ever asked me before. Did anyone ask you how you felt? I went through it in my mind. My mother, Miriam, Daniel, my father shaking Daniel's hand afterward, the low voices in the kitchen. I said, no. No one asked. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, that was not incidental. That was the practice. I sat with that for a long time, because she was right. The absence of the question was not an oversight. It was the entire design. Years later, after I left, I met a woman from another district who told me hers had happened 3 times. She said it's the way women like us say patriarchal things after we have practiced surviving them. Matter of fact. Hands folded. Eyes steady. That was when I understood that what had happened to me was not a strange event. It was a practice kept alive in places like mine, by everyone agreeing not to call it one. My body mattered. My usefulness mattered. The children I was expected to carry mattered. My obedience mattered. But my fear did not. I had passed an inspection I had never consented to. I am not a field. I am not a household tool. I am not a promise made between men about what a woman will or will not do well. I was a girl in a blue dress, standing in a room where no one asked the only question that should have mattered. Do you want this? No one asked me that. Not once. Not in either room. If you were ever prepared for a life without being asked whether you wanted it, tell me what question no one asked you. Subscribe to Leah the Amish Girl for more stories from Bassine Prayers Cap. And next time, I want to tell you about what happened after I moved into my husband's house and learned that even my kitchen was not really mine.